The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of an ambulance speeding down Main Street, sirens blaring in the early afternoon haze. Not an unusual sight, but then came another, and another. Within the next hour, the once busy streets of the city were gridlocked, not with rush-hour traffic, but with abandoned cars and frantic pedestrians fleeing in all directions. Chris Mendez watched from the gas station window as a man sprinted across the parking lot, eyes wide with terror. Behind him, a woman, her skin gray and peeling, chased him with inhuman speed. Chris barely had time to process what he was seeing before the woman tackled the man to the ground. A scream, raw and desperate, filled the air. And then, silence. The woman didn't just kill him. She tore into him. Chris stumbled back, heart hammering. What the hell? A hand grabbed his shoulder, and he jumped, turning to see Daniel, the station's owner. "Chris, you need to get out of here," Daniel said, eyes darting to the carnage outside. "Something bad is happening." Before Chris could respond, a crash came from the entrance. A customer, a woman in a business suit, had slammed into the glass doors, pounding on them with both hands. "Let me in. Please," she screamed. But as Daniel reached for the lock, a shadow loomed behind her. A bloodied figure lunged, sinking its teeth into her shoulder. She shrieked, falling against the door, leaving a crimson smear as she slid down. Chris felt his stomach drop. This wasn't a riot. This wasn't a protest gone wrong. This was something else. The store erupted into chaos as customers scrambled for exits. Daniel locked the doors, but it was too late. The creatures were everywhere now. A teenager bolted for the back door, but as he swung it open, 3 more of the things crashed through, tearing into him before he could react. Chris grabbed a fire extinguisher and swung wildly at one of the attackers, feeling the crunch of bone beneath the impact. It barely slowed the thing down. "This isn't happening," he whispered. But it was. The city outside burned. Police sirens screamed. People died in the streets. The world, as they knew it, was ending. And it had only just begun. Smoke curled into the sky, thick and black, blotting out the setting sun. The city was in complete chaos, cars abandoned on the streets, buildings on fire, and the distant sounds of gunfire blending with the horrifying shrieks of the undead. Chris Mendez sprinted down an alleyway, his lungs burning. Behind him, Daniel kept pace, panting heavily as they ran from the horde that had overrun the gas station. "They're everywhere!" Daniel gasped, glancing over his shoulder. Chris didn't need to look back to know he was right. The growls and snarls of the undead were close, far too close. "Just keep moving!" Chris shouted. The alley opened into a main road, but the sight ahead made Chris stop in his tracks. What had once been a bustling downtown intersection was now a war zone. Cars burned, their gas tanks exploding in violent bursts. Bodies littered the pavement, some dead, some still twitching. People fought desperately against the infected, some wielding baseball bats, others using makeshift weapons. But for every undead that fell, more seemed to take their place. A helicopter roared overhead, military insignia barely visible in the dimming light. A voice blared from a loudspeaker. "Remain calm. Evacuation centers are being established. Head to the stadium immediately for extraction." Chris exchanged a look with Daniel. "The stadium," Daniel said. "If we can get there, we might have a chance." Chris wasn't sure if any place was truly safe anymore, but it was better than staying in the open. Before they could move, an SUV screeched to a halt beside them. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a woman with short, dirty blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. A shotgun rested on the dashboard. "Get in if you want to live," she said, her voice sharp and urgent. Chris didn't hesitate. He yanked open the back door, pushing Daniel inside before diving in after him. The second the door shut, the woman floored the gas, tires squealing as the SUV lurched forward, weaving through the burning streets. "Who the hell are you?" Daniel demanded, gripping the seat as they narrowly avoided a crashed police cruiser. "Jessica," she said, eyes locked on the road. "And I just saved your asses." Chris peered out the back window. The horde was still chasing them, but they were losing ground. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "The stadium," Jessica replied. "Only place that sounds remotely safe." Chris and Daniel exchanged another glance. Fate, it seemed, had just made the decision for them. As the SUV sped toward the city's center, the world around them continued to burn. The skyline, once a symbol of civilization and progress, was now nothing more than a silhouette against an apocalyptic inferno. And deep down, Chris knew, civilization had already fallen. Now, all that was left was survival. The SUV roared down the ruined streets, its headlights cutting through the smoke-filled air. Fires burned in the distance, casting flickering shadows against the crumbling buildings. Chris, Daniel, and Jessica sat in tense silence as they sped toward the stadium, their only hope of escaping the nightmare that had overtaken the city. Jessica kept one hand on the wheel, the other gripping the shotgun resting on her lap. She maneuvered through the wreckage with practiced skill, her jaw clenched. "How do you even know the stadium's still standing?" Chris asked. "I don't," she admitted. "But if the military's setting up a safe zone anywhere, it'll be there." Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "And if it's already gone?" Jessica didn't answer. The weight of her silence settled in the car like a heavy fog. They turned onto a highway ramp, but the moment they crested the hill, Chris felt his stomach drop. The road ahead was completely gridlocked with hundreds of abandoned cars, some crashed, others simply left behind by those desperate to flee. And weaving between them were the infected, their grotesque forms staggering between the wreckage, searching for prey. Jessica slammed on the brakes. "Damn it," she muttered. "No way we're getting through that." Chris scanned the area. The highway was a death trap. If they tried to move forward, the horde would rip them apart. "We need to go on foot," Daniel said, already reaching for the door handle. Jessica shot him a look. "Are you insane? We won't last 5 minutes out there." "We won't last 5 minutes in here either," Chris pointed out. "Once they hear the engine, they'll be on us." Jessica swore under her breath but knew they had no choice. She reached behind the seat, pulling out a second weapon, a Glock, before tossing it to Chris. "Hope you can use that," she said. Chris checked the magazine. "Half full." "Not great, but better than nothing." Daniel grabbed a crowbar from the floor. "We move fast and quiet. No gunshots unless we have no other option." Jessica nodded. "Stay low. Stick together." They slipped out of the car, crouching behind the nearest vehicle. The moans of the undead filled the night air, their shuffling steps slow but relentless. Chris led the way, weaving between cars, keeping his breath steady. Every movement had to be calculated, one wrong step, and they'd be swarmed. A few meters ahead, a man was slumped against a truck, his face hidden beneath his hood. Chris hesitated. Was he alive? Jessica grabbed his arm. "Don't." Too late. The man's head snapped up, revealing blood-stained teeth and lifeless eyes. He lunged. A gunshot rang out. Jessica had fired before Chris could react, the bullet tearing through the infected man's skull. The shot echoed across the highway. And then, silence. For one terrifying second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then came the noise. The distant groans turned into frenzied screeches. Shadows moved between the cars. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. Chris's blood turned to ice. Jessica grabbed his wrist. "Run." They bolted. The infected surged forward, crawling over vehicles, crashing through windshields, desperate for flesh. Chris vaulted over the hood of a car, nearly tripping. Daniel swung his crowbar at a grasping hand, shattering bone. Jessica fired again, dropping one of the infected before sprinting ahead. The stadium was close, so close they could see its towering floodlights in the distance. But between them and salvation was a nightmare of teeth and claws. And the undead were closing in fast. The stadium loomed in the distance like a beacon of salvation, but between it and the survivors stood an ocean of the undead. The echoes of Jessica's gunshot had drawn them in droves. Chris's legs burned as he ran, dodging wrecked cars and hurdling debris. Daniel was right behind him, swinging his crowbar at anything that got too close. Jessica fired another shot, dropping a snarling corpse lunging from the shadows. But it wasn't enough. The infected swarmed from all sides, pouring between the abandoned vehicles, crawling over the wreckage like predators closing in on their prey. "There's too many," Daniel gasped. Chris spotted an overturned city bus up ahead, lying on its side with the emergency exit door slightly ajar. A temporary refuge. "There," he shouted. Inside the bus. Jessica didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the bus, reaching it first and yanking the door open. Chris and Daniel scrambled in after her, slamming it shut just as the first of the undead slammed against the outside. The bus rocked under the force of the horde. Chris leaned against the wall, catching his breath. "That won't hold them forever." Jessica wiped sweat from her brow. "We just need time to figure out our next move." A faint noise caught Chris's attention, a ragged, wet breathing sound coming from the far end of the bus. His stomach twisted. "We're not alone." The three of them turned toward the sound. In the dim light, a figure sat slumped in one of the seats, barely visible. A man, his body still, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Blood pooled beneath his seat. Chris inched closer, his gun raised. "He's dead." Then the body twitched. With an inhuman growl, the man lunged, clawing at Chris with unnerving speed. Chris fired. The bullet struck the creature in the shoulder, but it didn't slow down. This one was different, faster, stronger. Jessica reacted instantly, shoving the barrel of her shotgun beneath the creature's chin and pulling the trigger. The blast painted the ceiling red, and the thing collapsed. Chris stumbled back, his pulse racing. That thing wasn't like the others. Jessica wiped the blood from her face. "No, it wasn't." Daniel swore under his breath. "What the hell is happening?" "They're changing?" Chris exchanged a look with Jessica. If the infected were evolving, their chances of survival were growing slimmer by the second. A loud crash snapped them out of their thoughts. The bus shook violently, the undead were piling against it, their moans rising to a deafening crescendo. Jessica clenched her jaw. "We have to go. Now." Chris peered out through the broken windshield. There was another path, an old service tunnel leading beneath the stadium, its entrance just visible past the wreckage. "This way," he said, pushing the emergency exit open. The three of them spilled out into the open, sprinting for the tunnel. The undead followed, their numbers seemingly endless. Chris reached the tunnel first, yanking open the rusted door. "Inside, go!" Daniel rushed in next, followed by Jessica, who turned just in time to see the horde barreling toward them. With a final heave, Chris slammed the door shut. Darkness swallowed them whole. The air was thick with dust and mildew. The only sound was their ragged breathing and the distant pounding of the dead against the door. Chris fumbled for his flashlight and flicked it on. The tunnel stretched ahead, a long, decaying passage leading to the unknown. Jessica tightened her grip on her shotgun. "Let's hope this isn't a mistake." With no other choice, they moved forward, deeper into the darkness, where something else was waiting for them. The tunnel stretched into the unknown, its walls cracked and damp, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Chris's flashlight flickered as he led the way, its weak beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. Behind him, Jessica moved with silent precision, shotgun raised, while Daniel stayed close, gripping his crowbar like a lifeline. The pounding of the undead against the tunnel's entrance had faded, but Chris knew they weren't safe. "Not yet. We keep moving," he whispered. "No telling how deep this tunnel goes." Jessica scanned their surroundings. "You sure this leads to the stadium?" Chris swallowed. "It has to." They pressed on, their footsteps echoing through the desolate corridor. Rusted pipes lined the walls, some leaking foul-smelling liquid onto the cracked concrete floor. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Daniel exhaled sharply. This place gives me the creeps. Jessica glanced at him. Better than being out there with them. Chris didn't respond. His mind was focused on what lay ahead. If they could reach the stadium, maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Then he heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. A voice. Chris froze, raising a hand to signal silence. Jessica and Daniel stopped instantly, listening. Hello? A weak, trembling voice echoed through the tunnel. Chris's heart pounded. Jessica tensed. Could be a trap. Chris hesitated, then pushed forward. He rounded a corner and gasped. A group of survivors, 4 of them, huddled near an emergency generator, their faces pale and gaunt. 2 men, a woman, and a teenage boy, all looking terrified. One of the men clutched a bleeding wound on his arm. The woman, who seemed to be in her early 40s, stepped forward. Are you real? Chris lowered his gun. We are. Who are you? Melissa, she said, her voice hoarse. We were trying to reach the stadium, but we got trapped down here. Daniel eyed the injured man. Was he bitten? Melissa shook her head. No. A piece of metal caught him when we were running. Jessica exhaled, lowering her shotgun. You're lucky. The teenage boy, no older than 15, clung to Melissa's side. His eyes were hollow, his face streaked with dried tears. Chris knelt beside the injured man, examining the wound. It was deep, but not infected. He ripped a strip from his shirt and tied it tightly around the man's arm. This should hold for now. Melissa's eyes welled with tears. Thank you. Jessica scanned the group. We need to keep moving. If we stay here, we're as good as dead. Melissa hesitated. The stadium, do you think it's still safe? Chris wasn't sure. But he had to believe it was. We won't know unless we get there, he said. Melissa nodded. Then we're coming with you. They helped the injured man to his feet, and together, the group pressed forward. Minutes stretched into an eternity as they moved through the tunnel. The air grew colder, the silence more suffocating. Then, at last, light. Chris's heart leapt. Ahead, a metal staircase led up to a heavy steel door. The exit, Daniel breathed. Jessica climbed first, testing the door. It groaned as she pushed, then it opened. Chris stepped out into the open air. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he saw hope. The stadium stood before them, its massive floodlights flickering against the smoke-filled sky. The gates were reinforced with barbed wire, and military vehicles were stationed outside. People were inside. Survivors. Melissa let out a sob of relief. We made it, Daniel whispered. Chris felt something he hadn't in a long time. A chance. A future. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't the last ones left. But as they took their first steps toward the gates, something felt wrong. The silence. The stillness. And then a gunshot rang out. And everything went to hell again. The gunshot echoed across the stadium entrance, sharp and unforgiving. Chris barely had time to react before a voice rang out from above. Drop your weapons. Now. Chris turned to see soldiers standing on the stadium walls, their rifles trained on them. Floodlights flared to life, bathing the entrance in blinding white light. The survivors shielded their eyes as the heavy gates groaned open. A group of uniformed men stepped out, their leader, a hard-faced officer with a deep scar across his cheek, watching them with a cold expression. Who are you? He demanded. Chris hesitated, his mind racing. We're survivors. We were following the military broadcast. We thought this place was safe. The officer's lip curled. Safe? There's no such thing anymore. Jessica tensed, her finger twitching near the trigger of her shotgun. Are you letting us in or not? The officer tilted his head, scanning the group. His gaze lingered on Melissa and the wounded man before shifting to the teenage boy. New arrivals are put in quarantine, he said. For observation. Chris didn't like his tone. For how long? The officer didn't answer. Instead, he motioned to his men. 2 soldiers stepped forward, weapons raised. Chris's gut twisted. Something wasn't right. We're not infected, Daniel protested. The officer remained impassive. That's not your call. The soldiers moved in. One grabbed Daniel's arm, yanking him toward the gate. Another reached for Melissa's son, who screamed in terror. No! Melissa lunged forward, only to be struck across the face with the butt of a rifle. She collapsed to the ground, clutching her cheek. Chris reacted instinctively. He swung his pistol up. A gunshot exploded beside his ear. Jessica fired first, taking down the soldier who had hit Melissa. Chaos erupted. Daniel wrenched free, swinging his crowbar into the jaw of another soldier. Chris ducked as bullets whizzed past, diving for cover behind a rusted barricade. Run! Jessica shouted. The group scattered. Melissa dragged her son behind an abandoned truck as bullets tore through the pavement. The wounded man collapsed, unable to keep up. Chris pulled Jessica behind a concrete barrier. We can't fight them all. Jessica gritted her teeth. Then we find another way in. The stadium gates were shutting again, but beyond the gunfire, Chris could hear something else, something worse. The gunshots had drawn the dead. From the ruined city behind them, the undead poured forward, drawn by the sound, their eyes burning with insatiable hunger. The soldiers on the wall turned their guns toward the horde, opening fire. Chris seized the opportunity. This way, he shouted, pointing toward a side passage leading beneath the stadium bleachers. Jessica and Daniel followed, dragging Melissa and her son with them. Behind them, the undead slammed into the outer gates, their sheer numbers overwhelming the defenses. The screams of soldiers filled the air. Chris didn't look back. The stadium wasn't a safe zone. It was a trap. And they were running straight into the unknown. The stadium tunnel was dark, damp, and eerily silent, except for the distant screams of dying soldiers and the guttural moans of the undead swarming the gates behind them. Chris led the way, his pulse hammering as he guided the others through the narrow passage. Jessica was right beside him, shotgun at the ready. Daniel dragged Melissa's son along while she supported the injured man, her face set with grim determination. We keep moving, Chris whispered. No stopping. The tunnel opened into a maintenance corridor beneath the bleachers. Rows of lockers lined the walls, and ahead, a rusted metal staircase led up toward the stadium interior. Chris took a cautious step forward. Then froze. Something was ahead of them. A low, wet breathing sound echoed through the tunnel. A silhouette shifted in the dim light. Jessica aimed her shotgun, ready to fire. Then, the thing moved into view. It was an infected, but not like the others. Its flesh was stretched and mutated, its limbs unnaturally long. Blood oozed from open wounds, and its eyes burned with a terrifying awareness. It twitched as if sensing their presence, then let out an inhuman shriek. The sound made Chris's blood run cold. Then it lunged. Jessica fired. The blast shredded part of its chest, but the creature barely flinched. It slammed into her, knocking her to the ground. Chris reacted instantly, emptying his pistol into the monster's skull. Bullet after bullet tore into it, until, finally, it collapsed, twitching violently before going still. Chris gasped for breath. What the hell was that? Daniel yanked him back to his feet. No time to think. We have to go. The gunfire had drawn more of them. From the darkness, more figures shambled forward, infected, drawn to the noise. Chris grabbed Jessica's arm, pulling her up. Move! They bolted for the stairs. Chris hit the door at the top, shoving it open. And stepped out into the remains of the stadium. The sight stole his breath. The place was a graveyard. Rows of seats were abandoned, littered with skeletons and rotting corpses. The field, once a place of games and cheers, was now a battlefield. Crashed helicopters lay in ruins. Military vehicles smoldered, their occupants long dead. The safe zone had never been safe. And now, they were trapped inside it. The stadium gates groaned under the weight of the horde outside. Dozens of undead poured in through breaches in the walls, overwhelming the last of the soldiers still fighting. Melissa clutched her son tightly, her breath hitching. "What do we do?" Chris scanned the area, his mind racing. There had to be a way out. Then he saw it, a helicopter, sitting on the far end of the field. Damaged, but intact. A chance. He pointed. "There. If we can get to it." A gunshot rang out. Jessica cried out and staggered, blood blooming from her side. Chris whirled around. The scar-faced officer stood atop the bleachers, his rifle smoking. His uniform was bloodied, his expression twisted with rage. "You ruined everything," he snarled. Chris didn't hesitate. He raised his pistol and fired. The bullet struck the officer square in the chest, sending him tumbling off the bleachers. Jessica gritted her teeth, pressing a hand to her wound. "I'm fine. Let's go." The infected were closing in. They ran. Bullets and screams filled the air as they sprinted across the field. The undead surged forward, climbing over wreckage, reaching for them with clawed fingers. Daniel reached the helicopter first, throwing open the door. "We're clear." Chris hauled Melissa and her son inside, then turned to Jessica. She was slowing, her wounds slowing her down. A figure lunged at her. Chris shot it in the head, then grabbed her arm. Almost there. The infected were nearly on them. Chris threw Jessica into the chopper and climbed in after her. Daniel jumped into the pilot's seat. "Let's hope this thing still flies." He twisted the controls. The engine groaned, then roared to life. The rotors spun, kicking up dust and debris. The infected clawed at the helicopter, swarming around it. Then, with a violent lurch, the chopper lifted off. Chris looked down as the stadium disappeared beneath them. The last of the military, the undead, the failed safe zone, it all faded away as they soared into the dark sky. For the first time in days, Chris took a deep breath. They had escaped. But the world below was still burning. And their fight was far from over.